All right, so get this right. Like, in Britain, you can marry your first cousin. It's still legal.
Yeah.
Wild, huh?
Yeah, it is. It is.
But seems like that might be changing. There's this new bill in Parliament. They're thinking of making it illegal.
Right, right. Big discussion happening over there for sure.
So that's what we're diving into today. Cousin marriage, all the angles. The science, the culture, the whole shebang.
It's a big one. Lots to unpack, a lot of history, tradition, and then you bring in the genetics.
Exactly. Let's start there with the genetics. I was reading, and apparently there are some serious health risks for kids of first cousins.
Yeah, that's right. The research is pretty clear on that. Children of first cousins, they have a higher risk of birth defects.
How much higher, though? Like, are we talking a little bit or a lot?
Well, the studies, they usually say it's about 3 to 6% higher.
3 to 6%.
Yeah, which is about double the risk for kids of unrelated parents.
Whoa, okay, so double the risk. That's nothing to sneeze at, right? What kind of birth defects are we talking about?
Well, it really runs the gamut. You see things like heart defects, hearing loss. Some can even be born blind.
Oh, wow.
Cystic fibrosis, intellectual disabilities. It's a whole range, unfortunately.
So basically it's kind of a genetic lottery.
In a way, yeah. I mean, it's all about the genes, right?
Yeah.
So each of us, we get 2 copies of every gene. One from mom, one from dad.
Right.
Now, sometimes those genes have like little variations. Think of them like typos in a recipe, you know?
Yeah, I get you.
Most of the time, these typos, no big deal. But sometimes, if you inherit 2 copies of that same typo, one from each parent, that's when you can have problems. Diseases can pop up. And because close relatives, like cousins, share a lot of DNA.
More typos.
Exactly. More typos. More chance of both parents passing down the same ones. So yeah, the odds aren't great.
So it's not like guaranteed, but it's definitely riskier.
For sure. For sure. It's kind of like, you're playing poker. If you and your opponent are getting dealt cards from the same deck, the chance of you both getting dealt matching pairs, well, much higher than if you were playing with someone with a totally different deck.
Okay, I see. That's a good analogy. Helps to picture it.
Yeah.
So, we were talking about real-world examples. I know one of the sources brought up this Whitaker family.
Ah, yes, from West Virginia, right?
Yes. What's their deal?
Well, it's complicated, their story, and we got to be sensitive talking about it, but basically generations of isolation and marriage within the family. And that's led to a bunch of health issues, disabilities, both physical and cognitive.
Wow.
Really tough situation. It's impossible to say exactly what caused each person's condition, but it's definitely a real world example of what can happen when you have very limited genetic diversity.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this isn't just a theoretical discussion. It's Peter's lives.
Yeah, for sure. Which brings us to, the other big piece of this, the cultural side of things.
Right, because cousin marriage, it's not just some random thing, right? It's baked into certain cultures, traditions.
Exactly. All around the world, you've got different customs and beliefs. Some places, it's totally normal, even preferred, to marry a cousin.
And our sources were saying it's especially common among, like, British Pakistanis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In some UK communities, places like Bradford, it's pretty prevalent. Studies show something like 60% of marriages among British Pakistanis in Bradford are between first cousins.
60%.
Versus like 1% among white British couples.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So what's the deal there? What's driving that?
Well, lots of historical reasons, like in some cultures it was about keeping wealth in the family or land.
Right, makes sense.
Sometimes it was seen as a way to strengthen family ties. Like, your daughter's going to be treated well if she marries into the family. But of course, all these traditions developed in, very different contexts. What worked back then doesn't necessarily work now.
Right, different world. So how do those traditional reasons for cousin marriage, how do they stack up in modern day Britain? It seems like there's got to be some tension there, right, between like cultural practice and public health.
Yeah, that's the crux of it, the heart of the debate. It's about individual rights, right? People should be free to choose who they love, who they marry.
Absolutely.
But then you have to think about the potential consequences for the children for future generations.
Tough call.
Really is. How do you balance those two things?
No easy answers, for sure. And then you have this Bradford study that kind of throws fuel on the fire, right? Because it found a link between cousin marriage and higher infant mortality rates.
Yeah, the Bradford study, that's a big piece of the puzzle here. You can't ignore it. It doesn't necessarily prove that one thing directly causes the other, but The correlation is strong enough to make you think,
Yeah.
raises some serious red flags.
And I'm guessing this study, it's playing a big role in this whole debate in Parliament about banning cousin marriage.
Absolutely. It's front and center.
Yeah.
You've got those who are all for the ban. They're saying, look, we got to protect children, got to prevent these health problems. The government, they have a duty to safeguard public health, even if it means, putting some limits on individual choices.
Right.
Then on the other side, you have people saying, hold on, this ban, it's stepping on people's freedoms. It's targeting certain groups unfairly.
Right.
And they say there are other ways to address the health risks. Things like, more genetic counseling, more testing available to people.
It's complicated, man. It's like valid points on both sides.
Absolutely. You really got to dig into it, look at all the different angles.
So let's recap. We talked about the science, the genetic risks, right? We talked about the cultural factors, why cousin marriage is so common in some communities. We talked about the ethical dilemmas. And now, this whole legal battle brewing in Parliament, it's a lot, man.
It really is. I mean, it's like a case study in what happens when science and culture collide.
Head-on collision.
It's about personal freedom, versus public health. How do you decide where the line is? How do you balance all these different interests?
Big questions. No easy answers. So one last thought for our listeners. This just popped into my head, but what if genetic testing gets way better, way more accurate, to the point where it could predict these risks with near certainty? Would that change how you feel about this whole ban?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that we as a society are going to have to grapple with more and more as technology advances. I mean, that would definitely throw a whole new wrench in the gears.
Right. So much to think about. Well, we're out of time for today's deep dive, but wow, we covered a lot. I think our listeners are walking away with a much better understanding of this whole issue.
Yeah, hopefully. Really makes you think, doesn't it?
Definitely. Well, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Anytime.